ladies and gentlemen, and doctors. This is Scott McDonald. I'm so glad you're here. Today's topic is going to be what's on so many people's minds. It's the weather. And of course, we're talking about weather and locations. I don't know if you know this, but healthcare is extremely seasonal in the way that people act and react to it. Practices go on for sale. They think about moving. They consider buying practices, but it tends to be at just a few periods of time in the year. Now, to give you an obvious example, when you are celebrating Christmas, people go, oh yeah, it's the holidays, that's great, but they don't do anything else. There's also people who get the idea that when their kids are out of school, that's the time to go. Now, you probably know, all realtors know, that starting in June, that's when houses go on the market, and sales often continue through August and then tends to drop off in September. People who are investigating where to go, however, are usually doing that at certain times of the year. And right now, this is the time in which a lot of people have decided, I'm going to get out of Dodge. I can't stand this weather. Now, demographers all track the weather and climate. So if somebody says, is this area growing or not? Are people rich or poor? Obviously we've got that data, but a lot of people don't realize we also have the mean temperatures, highs and lows, and we track lots of things, as I will get into in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I'm that well prepared. So we're calling this the Goldilocks effect. You probably all remember the story of Goldilocks. Goldilocks was looking at the porridge was either too hot, too cold, or just right. Now, this Goldilocks phenomenon is actually pretty well, it's a thing that astronomers and astrophysicists and others have picked up on. What they're often trying to do is to say, I'm looking for a place, a planet that eventually we can settle, or that would tell us something about our own planet, and therefore you're looking for a place that's not too hot, not too cold. And that's the same thing with healthcare practices. Now, obviously, we at Dr. Demographics are doing all kinds of research as to where to go, places to suggest, and those locations that are going to not just be okay for anybody, but okay for you. Now, this is especially important when it comes to weather, because not everybody wants one thing. And the astronomers have different definitions of what a Goldilocks planet might be. One that has a certain gravity well, or they're looking for mean temperatures, or they're looking for water. So what is just right doesn't always work. And the same thing is true for the doctors that we're helping. Now, I will give you here a little bit of an explanation as to what you should be thinking about when you are considering what's the perfect place to go or not. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right. Now, my in-laws used to live in Phoenix. And in case you don't know, August in Phoenix, well, people don't have to repent of their sins because they're so used to living in hell. They figure that's okay. To me, it just gets too hot. But, the other thing is there are places that are too cold. But it's really subjective, and it shifts over time. Now, you probably know that Arizona, for example, which is among the most warm places on earth, and so is California, Southern California, Death Valley and such, did not have a lot of people who wanted to move there until there became dependable air conditioning. But the same thing is true with heating. Now, by the way, it's easier to heat a place than it is to cool a place, and it's also less expensive to heat rather than cool. A lot of people don't take that into account. But the means of heat, like oil or coal, make a big difference in how much the overhead will be in a location and how bearable a site might be. Now, in Arizona, the hottest recorded temperature is 128 degrees Fahrenheit. I have driven through the desert there, Maricopa County and Pima County, and found it miserable. But I also found a lot of people will have separate locations in which they'll practice and live. Now, in places like Montana, which has the coldest recorded temperature, it's minus 59 degrees. The same thing is also true. Arizona is spectacular in December, January, and February. Montana is heaven on earth in the hotter months of July, August, and September. And this is where the places that we see most snowbirds. There's a statistic that I want you to keep in mind, and it's the vacancy rate. Whenever you hear vacancy rate in terms of demographics, what it really means is people have left their primary residence at some time during the year. it doesn't mean that nobody wants to live there. So the vacancy rates in both Montana and Arizona are high because at sometimes of the year, people don't want to be there. Now, you'll also note that in your healthcare practices, and I'm going to use optometry and dentistry as prime examples, people don't want to go out of their houses at certain times. And so we recognize that's when we're going to have the lowest production figures in that location. And every site that you will move to, we have to take weather into account as it relates to production. Obviously, collections will vary based on the times of year. And January happens to be a rough time for a lot of people to come up with cash to pay their bills. So knowing that there's a seasonality, not only to the weather, but to the economy, matters in terms of where you want to set up your practice, where you want to go, what is going to work for you. Now, weather is not the first priority of most doctors. Let's be honest here. Doctors are going to be comfortable in their operatories or their offices, and they don't even care. But you know who cares? Kids and spouses. And we see a lot of kids who just are dying during some times of the year. It's freezing cold. It's really hot. I can't go here. So that's where we have the problems. It's not just the doctor. And it is kids and spouses, but it also matters to the patients because patient behavior is tied to weather. Now, we like to pretend that isn't true, but you know it is. Now, let's talk about a couple of facts in the about weather. Now, if you ever look at the news media, all of the weather stories come at certain times of the year. My recommendation is if you're looking for the perfect place to practice, do not pay attention to the news because it's only going to tell you what's going on today in how extreme the weather is. Now, we are recording this in July. And there are news stories that all over the country that are talking about how miserable it is outside. And I just hate this. Yeah, I got that. But that isn't necessarily a good way to plan your career. It's not a good way to plan your practice. But it is nevertheless a truth that there's a seasonality to everything that happens. Now, why in the world are all these news stories coming out when they do? And number one is because they sell papers or eyeballs in the media. And during hurricane season, every single time people will act like, oh my gosh, there's a major weather event. Not like there wasn't one last year at the same time, or there won't be in the coming years. But everybody wants to make every weather event great or terrible, most of the time terrible. Now, that is a benefit to someone who's aware of the trend and doesn't take it too much to heart. It encourages self-pity, incidentally. This is something I dislike very, very much. There are people who kind of like the idea of being miserable. How often did we hear stories in the lockdown where people are saying, oh my gosh, I'm dying here. I'm dying. Well, all right, we get it. You're dying. But everything tends to be cyclical, especially regarding weather, but it also is true with real estate prices. We're in a time right now of inflation. That's what everybody's telling us. But the inflation cycles are likely to get much worse later on. So looking at news cycles, and yes, I have a graduate degree in mass communications, the thing that you should be aware of is what you're being told serves the benefit of the media, but not necessarily the viewers. Hot and cold places are going to be, and I'm about to go out on a limb here, they're going to be hot and they're going to be cold next year, just about the same time of year. So why is anybody surprised that July and August are hot? Or why do we assume that January is going to be cold? It's the cycles. But here's the thing I want you to understand. If you are considering a place to practice, and frankly, weather can be important. Demographers track heat and cold, but there are other factors that may be more important to how the patient base will react, and even to your kids and spouses. Humidity is a major part of the situation. Places that have a dry heat or a dry cold are often more livable than places that have significantly great humidity or precipitation. Precipitation is highly localized, by the way. And if you'll look at precipitation maps, if you'll then track, is September big here with precipitation? It will be in some places, but not in others. In some locations, drought is predicted every year. We're going to have the driest year on record. Well, most of that is horse poo. I'm sorry to use the harsh language, but it's true. The other thing is true is winds. Now, You may be surprised that demographers tracked wind patterns. If you look in Southern California at the Santa Ana winds, that is a big story. If you look on the East Coast at a northwest, whatever, if you're looking in New England, yeah, those winds come up. Hurricanes, floods, this happens every year and they're predictable. I'm not trying to say it's something to ignore or to say it's no big deal, but it is predictable. Now, weather has nothing to do with global warming. I know this is or cooling. It surprises people when I say that. But if you look at the newspapers every time, or the radio, television, the same thing happens every year in the summer. And people talk about, oh my gosh, it's so much hotter than it's ever been. And then they will quote a statistic of a city that is out in the middle of some other place it's hard to get to, or they'll find a place where it's freezing cold and they'll say global warming or global climate change. I just want to remind you all scientists that you probably already know this. It may be that the Earth is getting warmer. It has gone through cycles of heating and cooling, but just because it's hot outside doesn't mean it's part of a climate change or a climate trend. That happens, but it's not the biggest news in the entire world. There are variations that happen, but they're usually measured over a long period of time, and I'm talking about 100, 200 years. And the differences between the highs and the lows in terms of climate is usually fairly narrow in let's just say units of measurement. I could say Fahrenheit or centigrade. The point is, I don't lose my courage just by saying the weather is somehow going to change. Now, the difference between weather and climate is weather changes several times a year. It may be hot today. It may be cold today, but it doesn't mean the climate is changing. We had in the 1800s a thing called the year without summer, in which there was, because of volcanic activity in the world, the climate dropped and there wasn't really a warming period and the crops failed. Now, that was a disaster. But the next year, after the particulate matter was removed from the atmosphere, it kind of solved itself. Now, it didn't mean that people didn't die, that fortunes were made or lost, but I'm just saying they're sometimes very hard to predict, very hard, and often they rely upon factors that we don't always know and understand. Now, if you're trying to figure out where's the best place in terms of me and what's right for me, I have to ask, what are your extremes? Now, you probably all know, and I'm going to sound extremely sexist when I say it, but women as a general group and men as a general group have different internal biological thermometers. Their point of homeostasis is different. Now, it highly individualized based upon the extremes that you're willing to go through. I moved from Sacramento, California to Lehi, Utah. And frankly, I love Lehi, Utah. It's a great place to live. But I kind of like the idea of the four seasons. As a boy, I would be so depressed on Christmas morning. I'd get up and rush out and find my new bike, and it's 78 degrees, and I was miserable. This is Christmas. Come on, what's the matter? So the extremes that you like in terms of your preferences and what you can stand matter a lot. You'll also note, incidentally, that your ethnicity and culture often are influenced by what extremes you and your ethnicity might find terrific. Having lived in Central America for several years myself, I found that some people thought the rainy season was the best time of year. Others that would find the hurricane seasons difficult. Some loved it. But I'm just saying the extremes are personalized. What are you accustomed to experiencing? Often I will say, can you tell me something about where you grew up? And did you like it? And surprisingly, some people actually want to live in Minnesota. I know, totally. And they find New Mexico and parts of Texas just heaven. I can tell you some of the worst experiences I've had have been in those states that everybody's saying, oh yeah, these are terrific. They're awful. So anyway, I want you to define for yourself what your normal is, what you are accustomed to. And I'm going to tell you why. I get a lot of people who are looking for the perfect place to practice and the perfect place to live. And so they'll ask me things like, well, where should I go? And I have to say, what's normal for you and what's your desired circumstance? Are you in a place that you really enjoy being in a suburb, having your kids go trick-or-treating to a lot of neighbors who are close by, or you kind of like being in the woods or in the desert or up in the mountains or whatever? Some people just love Manhattan. I have found it so difficult to live there. Oh, I'm so sorry. So ultimately, we're looking at weather in what is going to be right for you. Don't expect that someone else will be able to give you an objective criteria but we can give you the factual criteria to say this is a place that works and this is a place that does not. How broad are your extremes is another thing, because I think everybody likes to be comfortable. What means comfortable for you? Comfortable for you can mean I want to get up and have a cloudy day with humid weather. That makes me happy. But that's not your extreme, that's your mean. How miserable are you going to be if you get carried to the extremes? I'm going to tell you the truth. Like I said, I live in Utah and I live on a mountain in Utah. And I love living in a mountain in Utah. But there are 2 or 3 days a year I don't go outside. That's okay. It's because I've determined that my extreme is not that good when it comes to the very, very cold area. Same thing's true of very, very hot. So the extremes in my mind are narrower than most people. What do you love and hate in weather? Now, as I mentioned, precipitation is not the same thing as the heat and the cold, but there's some people who love a certain kind of thing. Now, if you can tell me as your demographer what you love and what you just get excited about when you wake up in the morning, I can help you to find a variety of places that will fit that, as well as other demographic criteria that are going to be fit for you. And precipitation, humidity, the temperature, hot and cold, and other factors that I can tell you about. Now, if you want to ever talk to us, you can reach me at 833-424-6222 or drdemographics.com. I have to explain something about our telephone number because it came up yesterday. We had a doctor who said, I've been trying 800-424-6222, and that used to be our number. But Target corporate had one number difference from that, so we were getting all kinds of, wrong numbers. I apologize, but that's why we changed it. Now, if you ever want to talk to us, do a telephone consultation, do a report, or even find locations that have factors that are particularly good for you, please let us know. We have got more data than you could imagine. And our purpose then is to help you find the place that is going to be the perfect place for you to practice. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.